Hello everybody, thank you for coming. You managed to park your cars or took a bus or something, I don't know. It's tough to get here sometimes. Well, this talk is entitled God's Will as You Choose, and we'll get into that topic. Get into the God part, the you part, the will part. There's lots to that statement. You know, it's really a fantastic opportunity for me to have you here to be able to talk about these things so that I can go home and research them. And without you to come and be interested in hearing about these things, I wouldn't get a chance to I wouldn't have the excuse to spend so much time digging into the great esoteric literature and picking out the good information. And it's interesting to me that you've come to hear something, or to maybe hear something that might make you think or could be of use or give you some information you didn't have. Because as I thought about the will for this talk, people are actually, they come and do the things based on their strongest motive. And to have a motive of actually just hearing something and learning something is a kind of a higher level motive. Most people won't really get off the couch for anything but a financial or an emotional or a physical motive. So I want to touch. I want to give you some credit.
I'll get off the couch for a touchdown.
That'll get him off the couch, true. Very true. So here we are. I always start these talks with an exercise having to do with consciousness, because, as Lawrence says, it's all about the evolution of consciousness at the core. And this exercise is to be fully self-conscious. Not like teenage self-consciousness, but to be aware of your own consciousness. To take a moment and see your own attention at work. Because your own, where the attention is where the self is. At the very core of ourselves is the source of the one giving the attention, right? So if you look at your consciousness and be aware of what it's up to, you're doing something that is a huge leap for consciousness and all the series of steps of evolution that we've gone through to get here, and that's to be aware of consciousness itself. Now, if you're choosing your thoughts, if you are aware of your own choices and consciousness, then you're not doing something that causes a lot of trouble, which is automatic thinking. Now, we actually spend most of our time in a state of automatic thinking, which is impulses of old patterns of prejudices and conclusions we've already drawn. Emotions rise up and we respond to them without even really being aware of the process. And the automatic thinking is actually the source of a lot of problems for all of us, because it's the old stuff. It's the stuff we're trying to transcend. You know, the patterns of reaction to other people's behavior that don't serve us. If we're saying an angry thing to a loved one, it's not because we're watching our consciousness. It's because we've slipped into automatic consciousness and something has surfaced. And, well, it's not, to be fully in self-aware consciousness at all times is to free ourselves of that. And that's something that it's a good exercise to repeat. I start the talks with that. And I think it leads right into the nature of the will, because if you're watching what you're paying attention to, you realize that in any given moment, we are flooded with external input from our senses, and our consciousness has got to deal with that. We've got internal input. We might all at the same time realize that our toe hurts and remember an embarrassing incident from high school and think of the big meeting we have tomorrow. All of that at once, and all of those things are competing for that precious attention. And it's actually a survival skill for us to ignore a great part of that and focus and choose what's really worth giving our attention to. That is an act of will. We're using our will all the time. Every single instant, we're using our will to choose what to give our attention to. And as we get into this discussion later, that's a critical thing. Where we put our attention has a big impact on our lives and determines what our lives are like and what we're going to do, where we're headed. So we make it through this onslaught despite being completely unaware that we're using our will, and a lot of people aren't really even aware that they have a will or are using it. Now, if you ask average person, what is the will? Oftentimes what the idea is for them about the will is the Victorian will. That's what Roberto Assagioli calls it, the will of plow through the obstacles, full speed ahead, and no weakness is, to be crushed and pushed aside because we must get, will must be enforced. And that's a kind of a scary will, but it actually, 110, 20 years ago, it was what everybody was focused on as the nature of the will. And of course, it fed right into some fine world wars. That's the kind of where that kind of will goes. If you've got, if you're trying to apply that kind of will these days in your own life, you find that you end up shutting down a big part of yourself. That kind of will doesn't allow you to be spontaneous or to be flexible even. It's going to accomplish what it's going to accomplish with the stiff upper lip. So Assagioli talks about something a lot better that hopefully we're all starting to work with now, the skillful will. The will that recognizes that everybody's input is important and that everybody is not just a lot of people, it's the committee that is us. Each of us is like a committee sometimes. And, I know people who have a will that they can simply decide what they're going to do and everything swings into line. That's probably because of a lot of practice. For myself, I've got to get the whole committee on board before I actually am going to do anything, especially something that's going to change my life. It's got to have the physical body involved, the emotional body, the mental body. They can't be arguing about it. It's all got to work together. So that takes some skill, and it's part of developing the will to figure out how you're going to do that. Get that integrated personality is the term in esoterics for when all of your pieces are working together. Another idea about will, if you talk to people about what they've heard about will or thought about it, is the idea of free will versus determinism. For hundreds of years, people have been beating that dead horse. The fact is that determinism, I talked about this in a previous talk. Laplace, a French philosopher, he really started the most logical basis for it when he said that at the beginning of the 1800s that if you knew where every atom was in the universe and how fast it was going, well, then you could predict the future, right? Because you'd know exactly, you could use the laws of physics to determine this one's going to be here or then. And he extrapolated that to say that you could predict what we'd be doing and thinking and what everybody would be doing, and that the future was predetermined. And that's kind of a scary thought, that whatever we do has already been predicted and we don't have any choice in it. And it turns out that's a big violation of the law of freedom that says that we all have the right to do whatever we want to do. And there's a logical basis that refutes that too, the idea of determinism. And that is that Laplace was smart. He had something. He said that matter and motion told you a lot about the universe, and he was right. But if you look at Pythagoras' teachings of hylozoics, the teachings that go back before way back, Pythagoras, what he taught was that there are three aspects to all of reality. There's matter, and there is motion. These are a priori. You can't prove them. You can't deduce them. They simply have to be accepted. If you're going to get any logical discussion going about reality, you've got to accept that there is matter and that it's in motion. There's a third factor, though, and that's consciousness. Lawrence Hylozoics says that everything has three factors to it, and it's when consciousness comes into the mix that everything becomes unpredictable. Consciousness moves matter around. So even though you might know where everything's going with the laws of physics, consciousness is continually throwing a monkey wrench into things, making choices. The material out of which our thoughts are composed is a kind of matter, and consciousness sets it in motion. So right there you can see that consciousness is influencing matter continually. Now the freedom to choose is in order to learn to choose better. If we accept Lawrence's statement that the purpose of life is the evolution of consciousness, well, we're going to have to try things out. We're going to have to live, be, right? That's how you learn. You can't learn just sitting there. And that process involves making choices, and making choices involves making mistakes. And it's all quite logical and expected and part of the program for our development that we choose and learn to choose better through our mistakes. And that might sound obvious, but it completely refutes something that a lot of people believe, that there is an infinite God capable of infinite punishment for sins that are just the mistakes that we make in order to learn anything. So if you've got any trace of that belief in you, of a God that's going to punish you eternally for your mistakes, root it out, because it's so contrary to the real plan of us having our big playpen of humanity in which we make all kinds of mistakes, we reap all the consequences, and we learn. And there we come to the title of my talk. God's will is you choose. That's the plan there. It's not like God has said, well, you're going to do everything my way. It's you choose that. You learn to develop your will. We're all gods in the making. And it's going to take a lot of work for us to make the best decisions. We all have a certain amount of limited power and sphere of our lives, and that grows as we make better and better decisions. Speaking of power, power comes with responsibility, and that has to stay in balance. And that goes along with the will too. And that's a theme I'm going to keep coming back to in this talk. If you're going to use your will, it needs to be within the law of freedom, especially respecting the right of everyone else to do whatever they choose to do, as long as it doesn't infringe on someone else's right to do that. That's what the law says. We have that right. Now, it's infringed all the time. We have governments doing it all the time, making the outrageous claim that the collective can make decisions for the individual. Esoteric says that's completely wrong, that the individual is the most important unit, that what we decide to do, we have a right to choose our path and our way of learning, and that it's not okay for any collective to declare itself superior to our individual will. There's no good argument for it anyway. I mean, look what collectives are capable of. You know, the state having a higher right to decide what we do than ourselves, that's ridiculous. The state is capable of the most horrible atrocities. We've seen that again and again. So if we aren't making mistakes, to get back to that, we're not using the will. And imagine if you'd never learned to read. How limiting that would be. You would not have the exposure to the great stories and to all the information and to the internet and to all the possible ways to experience this world and learn about it. That puts you in a pretty narrow world. Well, it's similar with the will. If you've never learned to use the will at all, if you don't apply it, it's a kind of a small world that you live in. You know, it's not going to be a lifetime that you look back on at the end and say, well, that was good. You know, I really got something done. No, I'm not going to think that at all. In fact, let's have an imaginary conversation with Joe Slacker. We'll ask Joe, what about the will? Do you think you might want to try to use that? Is that a part of your life? Well, you know, actually, I wanted to develop the will, but my favorite show is on TV tonight. And actually, I was going to have a beer or two, and I got some chips, and the show was on. And actually, tomorrow night is actually my really favorite. This is a good one tonight. And it just goes on and on like that. And there's not a whole lot of will in that person's life if TV and beer are the dominating factors, right? I can't judge that person. I don't really, you know, that could be perfect for them. Who knows, right, what the dynamic is for any individual's lifetime. We don't know. We have to just step back and say, well, it's not my way to do things. I mean, I have to confess, my biggest act of will every day is getting out of bed. That's a tough one for me. But I'm not as bad as Joe Slacker, you know, really, I have to say. And I'm a little worried about Joe Slacker because it's actually not very, if you're not exercising your will, it's like a muscle. It gets weaker. Pretty soon, you don't really have a lot of will to do things with anyway. And if you're just dissolving into the couch every night, your will is dissolving with you. And a guy like Joe Slacker might find himself if you're not exerting your will, there are all kinds of holes you can fall in, like drugs and alcohol are things that will helps you stay out of. And if you're not using your will, it's easy to slide into that. And next thing you know, your physical needs are stronger than whatever will you've got because you haven't exercised your will. And that's when you got to get some help. So there are a lot of people that learn about the will that way. And that's a dangerous thing about not having will, but boy, it can be annoying too, you know? If you've ever known somebody that isn't willing to make any decisions, right? Think of a person that's just, you can't get them to commit to anything and they don't want to make any plans. And eventually you have to end up deciding for them if you're going to get things worked out. And then they complain because it wasn't their decision, right? That's not a very pleasant aspect of things. You want those people to just at least make a decision that says, no, forget it, I don't want to do anything. And spineless people don't help anybody either. When they just say yes to everything, get overruled by whatever ego happens to be the strongest in the room, that's not serving anybody. You know, those people, you'd think they would at least have a good argument for developing the will. So, poor Joe Slacker, how do we help him? You know, let's suppose he actually does want to develop the will. He actually takes one moment of thought and looks ahead and sees where this road he's on very obviously goes. It's not a pleasant thought. If he can look ahead and see where the road of the TV and the beer is taking him, he's not going to really like the picture. Well, it turns out you can develop the will without that much effort. It doesn't take a lot of will to develop the will, which is kind of a catch-22. Yeah, you've got to have some, right? You've got to have some decision you're making and some intention to develop the will, but you can do it with a pad of paper and a pencil and sitting in a chair. If we look at Joe Slacker's future, or we look at the situations of people who don't exercise their will, it's not so hard for us to look back and find those things in our own past, right?
But isn't Joe exercising his will by making the decision to sit in a chair and watch TV?
It wasn't a big exercise. It didn't make the will a lot stronger. In fact, I don't know about how much will goes into that. You don't actually have to decide to do that.
Well, you say it's our right to decide.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's not judge Joe.
Yeah.
Maybe his last lifetime he saved the world.
Watching the Discovery Station.
He's becoming enlightened through means we don't understand. Maybe his beer is especially good. But if we're not going to end up like Joe, or we want to help somebody like Joe, we want to develop our wills, then how do we get started? How do we deal with that catch-22 of getting going? Well, we think about, where could I have used my will in the past? Yes?
Is the question on the consideration of what is a passive decision and an active decision?
A passive decision such as, I'm not going to decide,
So I'm going to watch television.
that's not going to exercise your will much, but you're right, it is a decision. But an active decision is going to be,
But there is a distinct difference between a passive decision
sure.
and a decision to be passive.
Sure, an active decision is,
Be active.
I'm going to watch TV and damn everybody else that criticizes me for it. But anyway,
Just the other point too, you mentioned earlier about past influences developing past habits and so on.
Yeah.
And that's the driving force for someone like that as opposed to
yes,
being present and making decisions now.
yes, and you might say that person doesn't really have a lot of free will. So Lawrence says that we've misinterpreted the ideas of free will and determinism, that yes, we have choices. No, the future can't be predicted, but most people don't really have free will because they're not using it. Their patterns are choosing for them. And by repeating the night after night the TV and the beer, it becomes harder and harder to break out of that. And less choice takes place on his part because it's inertia.
Yeah, you could say that about any habitual pattern. You don't have to use Joe Slacker.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Just say
that applies to
habitual pattern.
good patterns too.
Yes.
Get stronger and easier to do. And that's we're going to get into those. That's part of the techniques of developing the will, actually, to look at that. But to jumpstart your engine, I want to make sure we cover that part. The catch-22 of how you develop will if you don't have any will, right? You look at the things in the past where you could have used it I mean, and not just little things, like the time that you slept in and you missed the important thing. That's important. But think about a relationship you got into maybe where you knew it wasn't the right person you got involved with, but you were lonely and you both maybe knew that and you made a compromise and you ended up hurting each other really badly. That's a lack of will there to say, wait, I know this isn't right. I'm not going to go for the quick feel-good relationship that feels really bad soon. The will comes in handy in a lot of ways. If you can focus on those things and then focus on what it would be like to have a will that really was fully functional and did what you wanted to do, where you could make a plan and carry it through and look ahead and stand up to, maybe you've got somebody that is giving you a hard time at work or something like that, where you could just apply your will and draw a firm line instead of capitulating because you don't really have the will to. There are lots of situations where some will would make us feel better about ourselves. Think about both those things, write them down, and what you end up doing is strengthening your desire to strengthen the will. Lawrence says we're going to do whatever the strongest motive is, so you're going to have to build a strong motive to get yourself to do anything. And that has to be stronger than your patterns. It's got to be stronger than your inertia, which the esoteric books say inertia is the constant enemy for all of us. We all have to continually work to overcome that. If you have built a desire somewhat to develop the will, if you just do that again the next day, every time you repeat it, the desire will get stronger until you find yourself working on it. And then you can apply the techniques of actually building the will. And I recommend a book by Roberto Assagioli, and there's a quote for it in the handout. Handouts are over there on the desk, by the way. Pick one up if you want to read some good quotes. The exercising the will turns out to be something you can do almost continually. You're making decisions all the time, right? If you can say, I'm going to do this simply as a way to exercise my will and make it stronger. I'm going to not eat that cookie right now. Watch me develop my will. And then be proud of yourself, right? And you have opportunity. Will has many aspects. Patience is an aspect of will. Rather than being impatient to get with the driver ahead of you that's going so slowly. You can develop your will by saying, I'm going to just be content with the speed I'm going and not even think a negative thought about this person. That's an act of will. So if you've got, life can offer you those exercises, but you can make your own exercises. Like Assagioli even suggests exercises that are pointless for any other reason except to develop the will. Like one he suggests is standing on a chair for 10 minutes every day, determined to just simply be content to be standing on that chair. And stay there for the whole 10 minutes and not talk yourself out of it and say it's silly or anything, because it doesn't matter what you think once you've decided to do it, right? When you're exercising your will, you've made a decision, you're going to do it. That's how you know you've actually used your will, is you actually do it. That kind of exercise is, you might have to go through a lot to get through an exercise like that. It might feel pretty darn silly, but the point of it is that you've used your will and it's stronger. And every time you repeat an exercise like that, it gets stronger still. It's like a muscle to exercise. So an interesting thing about that is, you've all heard about The Secret, right? Then you can watch the video and you can learn how to have anything you want, and you can get all the money you want or whatever it is that you want. Well, they're just applying the law of activation and the law of repetition in that. And it turns out that rather than using it for money, you can really create something valuable for yourself. You can create a strong will that is a tool that you can use forever. Lifetime after lifetime. You can develop any quality within yourself through repeating it, through visualizing, through stimulating the desire for it, by imagining having it, by thinking about times you didn't have it and you really would have liked to have had it. You can build that desire, take action on it, and the techniques, Lawrence sums up really succinctly here. The law of activation says that every expression of consciousness becomes a cause that has an inevitable effect. So when you're thinking about something, when you're visualizing something, it's going to have some effect. Everything consciousness observes is affected. You're turning your attention to this affects it. everything contained in consciousness takes shape in some way. Creativity is continually taking place. Human beings are fundamentally creative beings. We're creating with our minds all the time. And everything that we see in this room was a thought, was an idea at some point. I don't know, let's not apply it to ourselves yet. That maybe is a bigger topic. But everything else was somebody's idea and is now picked up its desire nature. The desire brought together the resources to make the physical object. Everything, okay, without your own activity, consciousness does not develop, nor are any qualities or abilities acquired. Everything is through our own effort. Everything you strive for or wish to accomplish in order to obtain or realize it must first be contained in your consciousness. We're not going to get anything that we haven't first made contact with in our minds. Everything that you get, you have desired at some time. Everything you desire, you will get at some time, though seldom exactly as you had imagined. There's a lot of time intervening, and we've changed along the way there. So, and among the exercises for developing, like any quality, will is just one of the qualities you can develop. They rely on repetition, and the law of repetition. By each repetition, the content of consciousness is reinforced and is continually easier to resuscitate. By each repetition, the tendency to recur is strengthened. Every time you repeat, it's more likely to repeat. By repetition, thought and feeling are reinforced more and more until they are automatically expressed in action. If you'd like to see some new actions in your life, through thought and feeling, you reinforce that until those thoughts and feelings are going to bring about that action in your life. The law of repetition is really powerful. By each repetition, thought becomes ever more active, ever more firmly engraved in memory. By each repetition, the fictitiousness of thought and illusoriness of emotion become ever stronger and seem ever more probable, legitimate, and necessary. When you've got a religion that's proposing something ridiculous, if enough people repeat it enough times, it starts to sound plausible. So it's really good if you're going to apply the law of repetition, make sure you're working on something that's true, and not be repeating something, some pattern or habit that you don't want to have anymore. So that's the law of activation with its subsection, the law of repetition. And now, maybe some of you are going to do these exercises and you're going to develop the will further. It's important to stay in balance. When we're acting from the head, it's usually where we're working on our will from. We need to have our hearts involved too. It's pretty scary when people get their will developed out of balance with their hearts. And that, unfortunately, is pretty common in this world. In fact, there are a couple different ways to make it through the human kingdom. And at two extremes is complete adaptability, rolling with the punches and flexibility in every single way, sowing the minimum bad karma, doing whatever the minimum is required to make sure you get to the next step, and then making it through with the minimum effort. And these people are artists at life. They know how to get through life with the minimum of difficulties. At the other end of the spectrum is the approach of self-assertion. And these people treat every single thing in the world as an obstacle to their will. They see the world as it is and want it to be the way they want it to be. And that's actually the easier thing for us to imagine, is those sort of people, because we run into those people, and those people actually get stronger and stronger through this effort. They have very vivid experiences when they fight their everybody is perceived as an obstacle, right? And they fight those people or strive to overcome them and have very strong experiences that develop all kinds of abilities, the ability to remember and focus and integrate their own personality and draw on the resources of their inner selves. It's amazing how strong these people can become, but they're out of balance, and they unfortunately end up running the world. And that explains a lot of the messes we have, because somebody in that position doesn't even recognize that the direction of progress is towards unity. Unity is not even a factor in their minds. They see their individual will as the important one, and everybody else as having a will that they either need to get aligned with theirs or steamroller. those people, unfortunately, sometimes we actually have to fight those people to keep everything together in this world. But here's the thing, they can take that path, and it's the slow path. It might take them an extra billion years to make it through on that path because they're fighting the whole way. They don't get the picture. They don't see how unity is the goal. They don't see anybody beyond them because the people beyond them are people who are better at unity, and they don't even recognize that in them. So they think they're the best. And at the end, they eventually realize it. At the end of this long effort of tremendous battles and defeats and victories, they realize that unity is the only way. It's the only way to the next kingdom. The next kingdom is about love and unity. That's the nature of it. You can't get there as an egotistic individual. You have to completely conquered separative, selfish tendencies to join the collective consciousness of the next kingdom. These beings want to get there. They figure out they have to get there. They start to work it out, these people. And you know what? When they make it to the next kingdom, they're some pretty powerful people. Or they're not people anymore. They're whatever you want to call, the masters we call ourselves, the people that make it the next kingdom. They're very powerful. They've acquired a lot of skills and determination. Their will is fully developed. And they're actually called in as troubleshooters with difficult humanities on other planets. Whereas somebody who's the artist of getting through life with the minimum effort is not called in to troubleshoot difficult humanities. They have different roles on the other side. So it's kind of a law of compensation is what Lawrence calls it, that as much as we might think, God, what a terrible choice to do things that way, and I do feel like it would be the choice for me, it'd be a terrible choice, it pays off in its own way. So if we're talking about who runs the world again, we can talk about collective will. The will of the collective. If you're looking at our government right now, and you're looking at how will is working in that government, it's really pretty sad. It's, the word, the air around us is a gas, right? And that actually comes from the Greek word chaos. And what's going on around us here, it's like each molecule has a little will of its own, and it's zipping along in some direction or other. And they're going an average of 1,000 miles an hour, every air molecule in this room. But they're all going different directions. So the air isn't going anywhere. If they were suddenly all bounce off each other and be going the same way, we'd have 1,000 mile an hour wind that would take out that wall and us with it. That's kind of how people are too. All of our wills, like little arrows pointing different directions. And if you look in Washington, not only are they pointing all over the place, but they're just opposed. And it makes it really clear that we can't expect anything from Washington as far as solving any of our problems, and that these are not the most enlightened beings we've got around. The beings of the next kingdom, they disagree about things. Humanity is something they often disagree about, because how we're going to get through this mess is humanity will take a set of choices and make the worst possible one. So they can't even figure out what our free will is going to do next. But these leaders that we have, in that next world, they'll actually agree to something, though. They'll disagree, and then they'll agree, okay, we'll follow a leadership that we've put together here, we'll come up with the best plan, and we'll apply it so they can get something done. But that's not happening in Washington. It's not going to happen, and we can't even blame the people that are there, because we put them there, we voted them there. We didn't put people there who could actually solve these problems. And the funny thing is it's not these people's fault at all. Their personalities. They're doing the thing that they do. We put them there. They do what they do. It's predictable. What the real failure is of people who are more advanced than these souls that we have in Washington. Those people aren't stepping up and taking responsibility and getting themselves elected. I mean, thank goodness we have somebody like Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt who applies some will to their spiritual understanding and steps up and takes a leadership role. And it looked the same to them as it does to anybody now, just chaos in Washington. They stepped into it, and one saved this country and the other saved the world. I don't know where those people are now.
When you said that a moment ago, I caught an image of two porcupines attacking each other with quills of personal will.
Well, the types I was talking about, the people that see everything as an obstacle, they're very common in Washington, and they probably are porcupine would be a good mascot for those people. So it's incredible how powerful aligned wills are. If everybody in this country, like sometimes a war, the threat of something horrible, will line our wills up, and next thing you know, we're turning out B-52 bombers at an incredible rate. Where everybody's working together and it's all working out. But let's not do it out of fear. I mean, I hope that someday we can actually unite out of appreciating the power of uniting. So let's go up a notch from collective will to divine will. This talk was entitled God's Will as You Choose. So, like I said, the next kingdom, nobody serves ego there. And it's where we get our facts from. This research I've been doing is into the books such as those from Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and Leadbeater, Besant, and especially Lawrence is my main source. These people are getting their facts from those in the next world who've overcome all the human obstacles, well, that sounds like a biblical quote, I have overcome the world. Yeah, that's really what somebody who's made it to the next kingdom has done. They've overcome all that we face in the worlds of humanity. The physical, emotional, and mental challenges they've mastered, and that's one reason we call them masters. They can see, they have verified this information with their own senses we don't have yet. They can see causality, they can see objectively, mentally, they can look into the past as far back as they want to go to see where the causes originate of things. As humans, we really don't have much of ability to do that. It's actually kind of, the human kingdom is supposed to be the toughest place of all the kingdoms. We have many more ahead of us, but it's the loneliness in our isolation in this kingdom and our sheer ignorance in this kingdom. We're just basically waking up to the fact that we can know anything, and we're starting to develop that. Between loneliness and ignorance, we then use our will to make some really bad choices and turn this world into a pretty tough place. So, fortunately, the next kingdom is all about love. It's all about unity. And those people reach back, not people anymore, I can't really use that word for them. They've overcome everything that you could apply the word people to. They step back, and in the spirit of compassion, they want to help us. And they offer us this information. And this is a really important agenda of mine here, is to encourage you to look at these sources, get your own conclusions, and I'd love to talk with you about them. Especially, Lawrence is not very well known. Have a look at what he has to say. It's really lays it out there clearly, especially for a Western mind. It's not full of Sanskrit or any tough terms. If we've got this far, we're all made into the human kingdom. Yeah, it's tough, and we've made a big mess of it, but we can also be proud, because each of us is a point of consciousness that's had to evolve through the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom. To get this far, it's taken billions of years, and we didn't get any of this for free. Our ability to think or see or digest food or move, all of that is the result of our efforts along that long path. And every monad is the term for the tiniest point of consciousness, that the consciousness, matter, and motion, the tiniest point of that, that's what we are, each of us, and everything else is body around that. Every monad, even the ones making for body now, has ahead of itself that same multi-billion-year journey through the cosmos to eventual godhood, if we're going to use the word God, which is a little iffy, but to eventual mastery of all the kingdoms ahead of us. And that's where we're headed, and it's quite inevitable, and we're just affecting the timing. And I'd rather be millions instead of billions of years. So that's why I'm interested in this information from those who've gone ahead. I'd like to see how we can progress, and the will is a part of that. Now, and also, as difficult as the human kingdom is, what we get out of it is absolutely precious. We get individuality. We have to have that individuality to make it into the next kingdom, because if you're going to join collective consciousness, you'll be swept away unless you're a very firm point of your own intention. If each of us can, from a point of our intention, decide how to do things and what to do and help and make choices, then we can participate and help in the kingdom of unity. And that's all that you want to do when you're in that kingdom too. Selfish motives are gone. And each of us is a really interesting and valuable contribution to that kingdom too, because by the time we get there, we have developed a lot of unique abilities and perspectives. Billions of years of different choices makes every individual so completely unique that the talents and the beauty and the potential contribution of each individual is fascinating to observe. I mean, right now in humanity, a lot of people are even just trying to develop individuality at a fairly basic basis. They don't have personalities really. They want to develop personalities, and that's appropriate for them. Then once they've developed personality, they want to be a powerful personality, and that's appropriate too. We can't judge. But once you've been a powerful personality, maybe if you can actually set enough forces in motion around you, you could be of use to the next world in saving the rest of humanity. Well, saving is the wrong word, but in helping the rest of us make the grade. So I wanted to emphasize the importance of individuality. Yeah, we use the word God, and we say, God knows, or God help us, or, God's will. Yeah, that just means we don't know, right? We use the word God for I don't know. And in the next kingdom, they know. They don't actually use the word God. They don't really need it in that same way. They see how it works. They see the causes. They're not describing it to some blind tyrannical God like this is depicted in the Bible. Some God that is just arbitrarily doing whatever he wants, which is completely not the way it works. In fact, the whole idea of God being an individual doesn't really make a lot of sense if you look into esoterics. The closest concept is the one consciousness that all of us are a piece of, that being God. But any interaction that we have with the divine worlds or further things beyond human is going to be through individuals. And in fact, when those individuals in the next kingdom want to help this humanity, this world, they have to work through us. We're essential to them. They need the most advanced people, the people who are at least willing to serve, to step up and do something. So it's always working through individuals, and to us, to meet any of the individuals in the next kingdom is like meeting a God. They're so far beyond us. And there are beings far beyond that too. It's just a whole hierarchy of beings. So polytheism is really closer to the truth than monotheism. But the good thing about monotheism, Islam and Christianity and Judaism is that it focuses on unity. It does say that there's one consciousness. We're going to unite in that consciousness. Maybe we would each of us like to serve. Maybe we're at that point where we want to try to help humanity. Again, the masters, the higher ones, don't tell us what to do. They don't give orders. They don't give commandments. They don't insist on anything. If you want to help, if they're going to give you, that's their gift to you as an opportunity. And the way they give you the opportunity is they give you a glimpse of a part of the plan for enlightening humanity. You see a little bit of it, and it's up to you how you can help with that. They don't tell you, okay, we want you to go start this religion or write this book. It's not like that at all. They respect the law of freedom in every detail, and that means not imposing their will on us. There is no divine being that will impose its will on any other. So, given a glimpse of the plan, we get a chance to say, well, maybe I can help bring that about somehow. And that's how we develop and get closer to the kingdom.
So how do they guide us then?
Ideas, and the gifts are opportunities, right? Giving people opportunities to serve better or more. If you sincerely want to do that, then the opportunity given to somebody would be to share information, or it would be to set an example, or to write the music that lifts people's souls, or to set in motion a new movement. The labor movement was actually started by disciples. It actually separated, it kept the powerful people from enslaving everybody else. We had to have that. course, we wouldn't need it if government had actually been effective in its job. We wouldn't have needed that. But,
We don't have government.
well, we're human too.
So would the ascended masters also be included in the muse? So
The
the muse to bring us the creative ideas?
That's interesting. I don't know about. I know that muses are in effect, right? That I've listened to music where it's obvious that some influence of such beauty and power has come in to help. That is something like a muse, and I wonder how that works. But if I knew more, I'd probably be working with them. So. You don't wait for the masters to give you a peek at the plan before you try to do anything good. There's opportunities around us all the time, and just an expression of goodwill, continual goodwill, trying to serve unity, trying to recognize unity, not to exclude anyone. If you exclude anyone, you're excluding yourself. Goodwill eventually grows into will to good, and that eventually takes you near the end of your time through the human kingdom, where they will actually teach you about real will, which we don't know much about. But in order for us to have the power of real will that really could control matter of all kinds around us, emotional, mental, and physical, is subject to our will. When we get to that point, to have that kind of power, we have got to purify it out, almost all of the selfish tendencies, the egoism. So that's there's plenty of that for all of us to work on. I can't speak for you. Lots for me. Part of this, there's a very intimate, personal part of help available for us. Our own souls are these beautiful, advanced beings that are us, waiting for us to identify with them. They've been waiting millions of years for us to even recognize that they're there, waiting for us to identify with them and start the process that Lawrence calls identification and liberation. When you identify with a higher self, you're liberated from the lower. So starting to try to think as if the soul operates from a plane of complete love and unity and no ego. As if the soul, how would you act and stay in harmony with that, a being of that level? There's a mystery here that I'm not going to try to explain, that only Lawrence has answered for me. How is it that we are these bumbling humans down here and these beautiful, radiant souls at the same time? That puzzled me for many long years. But Lawrence actually explains that, and it's very interesting, and maybe it's a topic for another talk. But the clue is, when you realize that the universe is run by love, it starts to become more apparent why that is. A lot of people want to turn their will over to God. And that's tricky business. Because how do you really know whether you're turning over to God or not? Or are you maybe just serving your own ego in this effort? You want to declare yourself a disciple of God or empower your efforts. I don't know. It's really good to analyze your motives. And like Lawrence says, your strongest motive decides what you're going to do. So work with your motives. Strengthen the good ones. Analyze those that are in effect when you do something. Why do you really want to do this? Speaking of analyzing motives, why am I here? I want to share this information with you guys. That's really my motive, and it's quite sincere, but I'm a committee too, and my ego also wants to be here. I couldn't do this, right? So that's part of if you're going to get your committee together to do things, you bring on board even, my intentions aren't completely pure if you look at it that way, right? My ego is here because it likes some attention. Okay, that's fine. But really, my basic desire is to share this information. And if that's what I need to get my ego here is to give it a chance to get some attention, that's fine, right? Let's not be too hard on our egos. We actually need them. And we're developing them, and they're tools for us, and we keep them. If we're going to keep working in this world, you got to work through some kind of person, you got to be somebody. I've read too many things that, that's just a personality thing, completely dismiss it. But you're going to need your personality here if you're going to do anything in this world. In fact, getting an integrated personality where your mind and emotions and physical working together, that is a key aspect of really getting something done here. And, okay, back to surrendering to God's will. God doesn't do, and by word God I mean the soul. That's who we reach when we try to reach God. The first thing we reach is our own soul. And of course, souls are all in perfect conscious unity with each other. And the higher beings that we might work with and call God. If you want to try to work with God, don't be asking God don't look in the fridge and ask God what to eat, right? God is not going to do anything for you that you can do for yourself. And that's pure common sense. Anybody here who is a parent knows that if you're still tying your teenager's shoes for them, you're not helping them. You know, they need to be able to do for themselves what they can do for themselves, and you really need to encourage them to do that and not do it for them. So it's unreasonable to expect help with the things that we can already do for ourselves. It's also reasonable to expect help with the things that we can't do. And actually, when we look at our government, it's obvious we can't govern. We can ask for some help for that. We're not going to get the help until we ask for it. So actually, one of the things that's going on in our government right now is it's demonstrating how it can't do it, so that we can be encouraged to actually ask for something better and more. Surrendering your will to anybody, anything, is a dangerous thing, actually. We have our will for reasons. We've got to develop it. I made a huge mistake once in a marriage when I was arguing all the time with my spouse of saying, okay, you're right. I'm not going to argue. Whatever you want, we're going to just do that. Because I just couldn't stand to argue anymore. And boy, was that a big mistake. For one thing, I was awfully boring after that, in her mind. And for another thing, I disappeared. I was in the marriage, but there was none of my opinion, none of my taste, none of my choices. I basically lost my ego out of the whole thing. And boy, that was the end of the marriage, and I had to reconstruct an ego. So don't make that mistake. Your opinions, you stick to your guns if you've got an individuality. You need to express it. Deep down, you know it. So don't get steamrollered. And also, among those who are interested in running the show for you, not just politicians or spouses maybe that don't understand they shouldn't, or there are discarnate entities that, you know, as we approach Halloween here, maybe the veil's a little thin. I don't know. We might bump into some of these. But there are people who basically take so little interest in their own life or making their own choices, and they'll open themselves up to kind of a possession that is really maybe very exciting to view from the strange distance they're at, but they've given themselves over to being controlled by another being's will, and that's only bad. That is just pure bad. I mean, nothing good comes out of that. These beings shouldn't have that ability to express themselves in this world. You know, they're in the next. They need to stay there. So, you know, one thing I definitely want to come back to is, you know, we're talking about surrendering your will to God. Well, look at your own will and ask am I being reasonable? Am I being loving? Is my heart in this decision? Am I being kind to myself? Would I treat my best friend like I'm treating myself? If you can answer those questions as positive, then you're probably okay with your will. You're on the right track. And you know, don't be afraid to use your will. It's like Amelia's teacher told her years ago, told her and her group, get out there and make some karma. You know, you're just sitting around. Go make some karma. That's how you're going to learn. But the best thing we can do is make sure that we're at least coming from the right place the best we can. Make sure that who is using the will is something we're considering. That exercise of self-consciousness really helps you be aware of who. And if the ego is not evil, but just don't identify with it and think it's you. You're more than an ego. You're a divine being that is expressing through an ego. We're learning that slowly. Don't expect to get it all at once. But all you have to do with the ego is see it. Eckhart Tolle is really strong on this. If you can witness the ego, the emotions, the mind kind of trying to lead you into fear of the future, or regrets about the past, anywhere but the present. If you can witness the mind doing that, it loses all its power. He talks about the pain body, all the negative patterns and expressions that we've ever had that kind of come together and have a life of their own, trying to preserve themselves as in making us suffer. Well, just it thrives on your attention. It thrives on being believed in us, identifying with it. You need to be free of it, see it, and not identify with it. Just see it in action. Recognize it's going on. The mind, the pain body, the lower nature, the whatever it is, if you've got just enough distance from it to see, wait a second, I choose some other influence within myself and listen for the higher, subtler influence. You're going to be better off. And that's another act of will. Talking about being of use to those who are trying to help humanity, I was having an argument with a Christian friend of mine once, and I said the wrong thing. I actually avoided saying the wrong thing for quite a while. But I finally did. And what it was we finally got onto the topic of reincarnation. And I finally said, what use has Christ got for you? You've come through one lifetime here, you've picked up one new skill, and worked off a little bit of karma. You're not suddenly ready to sit at the right hand of Christ and help save the world, Christ needs people who've really got it worked out. He needs integrated personalities, people who can at least take care of themselves and aren't asking God what to eat, So that's where the argument for reincarnation is very strong. We keep coming back till we get good enough at stuff, so we really have something to give.
Well, even Christ said he'd come again.
Right?
That's what I tell my Christian friends.
That's right. And that reminds another story about Christ. I actually agreed with this Christian person on a lot of aspects, but Christ is pretty darn amazing, right? And he heads up this great organization of divine beings and works with the angels and everything. That's all great. We agree on that, and I tried to stay on that, but I couldn't quite stay on it. But I read an interesting thing in one of the esoteric books about how Christ was recruiting people to work with him on a particular project having to do with humanity. And when he sent the masters out to look for the people that would work with him, they looked for the people who had the integrated personalities, who were getting stuff done in the world, who were very will-oriented and very capable of getting a lot done. And they didn't actually worry that much about them having a developed heart aspect or love aspect. I thought that was interesting, and the reason was that when these people were brought together with Christ, his tremendously powerful love aspect would immediately fully activate theirs. So they didn't worry about it at all. They knew that those people, in the presence of so much love, would then operate with love within themselves. I thought that was interesting. It kind of emphasizes that, being a nice person is all well and good, but if you're actually going to be actively serving and helping, you're going to have some stuff together in your personality, in your life, and a relatively good amount of will in effect. Oh, and before I move on to questions, I'm going to give my conclusion, then ask questions, because I've already heard some good ones. I want to say that if you haven't got the handout, there's one over by the door, and I just could not edit it down. It's got 6 pages of good quotes in there. I hope you're interested enough to read those, because most of them from Lawrency and some from Roberto Saggioli, and it mentions the books that I used on the handout. And also, we have groups. If you want to talk about these things or do meditations, you can come to one of the group meetings, which is every Thursday night here in the city somewhere. Every other Thursday there's a Lawrency group, Rainbow Bridge Meditation group, and then in Port Townsend we have a Rainbow Bridge Meditation group. And I'd love to see you there and talk about these things. Also, this material, the Lawrency material, is online. It's in the bookshop. It's on the CD. And the CD that you can get here, that Ed can get for you, has got all kinds of great stuff on it, Theosophical and Lawrency, just a real treasure trove. I talked about that tough time in my life where I kind of lost my will and had to reconstruct myself, lost my ego. That was a tough time. And getting out of that, I had to actually put my dreams and hopes and for myself on a shelf, because making it day to day was it. That was all I could manage. And that's something to respect in yourself too. If you're going to set up goals for yourself with the will, and have some compassion for yourself. If maybe where you're at is making it day to day, that's enough. That can be enough. And if maybe you've reached the point where you've been making it day to day for 10 years, like I have recently, and you look at your life and say, you know, I don't need to be satisfied with just that anymore. Maybe it's time to reach for that shelf and just see if I can pull my dreams back off the shelf. Well, if you want to do that, that's going to take some will. So I'm personally going to be trying to develop that will and go for it, and I encourage that for you. So thank you. So let's move on to questions.
Well, I do have that question.
Yeah.
Do you think that people, when they give up their will to God, it's because they are terrified that it's really their responsibility?
Let me repeat that, and you can tell me if I got it right. Do I think that people give up their will to God out of fear that their own will is really the cause of their problems? Is that a way to put it?
No.
Not quite?
I think, do they give up their will to God because they're terrified to know that it's their responsibility, that they have a will, that
I
they
see.
need to activate their will, that they are responsible for their life, that they are responsible, not some being floating in heaven.
So you're saying that it's possible that people feel like it's easier just to give their will up to God than to take on their own will.
It's kind of a cop-out.
Yeah, kind of well, it's just God's will, and I don't really need, well,
Well, they could be terrified of making a mistake.
terrified of making a mistake. Religion can have people petrified because they're terrified of making a mistake, absolutely.
Yeah, they're terrified of consequences that have been made up by man.
And we've all been told that self-will and being willful, just the word willful is considered bad, yeah. And,
Especially for women.
oh, willful women, oh my goodness. And then we've also seen examples of people misusing will too. You know,
But I still see, and I have some friends, I'm a Buddhist, so I'm just the opposite way. I have to realize that everything that happens to me, I'm participating in. Well, my
Yeah.
Christian friends always go, oh, it's just God's will, just give it up to God, that's all you have to do. And I think, oh.
well, that's giving it all up to God. It also seems to go hand in hand with the idea that whatever we've done, we can have all the consequences erased immediately
Yes.
by being born again, Christians or whatever.
Yes.
And it doesn't actually work that way either. If you've set things in motion, they're going to come back around.
Cause and effect.
But you've got, there's grace and beauty in that too. You never get more than you can handle.
I think
Yes.
rather it's a question of a focus on what is good. It is a will, it's a decision to focus on what is important. I think that's behind many of those people who express that also. It's not a cop-out, it's a decision and a focusing.
Okay.
Saying
A total
they're realigning their
realignment
path.
with goodness.
You're saying this is their choice. And they're in grace and they're in the path of grace.
Okay, so I actually think it's true that for some people it's a cop-out, but I agree with this too. That doesn't apply to everybody. Some people, when they're making that, they're making a sacrifice of their own will to a degree, but that's their will in action.
It's their will in action to align themselves with what they think is important. And I think it's a focusing on their
And that,
I
and,
think it's a beautiful expression, usually when it is, but I mean, it can be
and it also means like a good stoic acceptance of what is too, which is vital. If you're arguing with what is, you're going to have a problem. If you can just accept it, sometimes the word saying God's will is a way of accepting that. And it's an admitting that we really don't know. That's a good thing to admit to.
Well, also there's a higher level. It's like, instead of just my will of ego, you want to seek even higher level of will, which is more loving and more compassionate. And
Yeah, there's,
more full of life. So then, I think there's many people use the God's will in a very different meaning. Like the worst case is
Yes.
hop outside,
right.
which I've done for many years. And then I've done some of what she mentioned. And also I applied with that just now for my mom that, you know, some Christians wrote me and saying God's will be done, saying goodbye to her. But I said, no, I'm going to use my will and God's will for her life. And
Yeah.
I just saw it was reasonable and loving, and I worked it. Like, you know, friends prayed for me, and that worked. My mom is okay now. So there's
Yeah.
many. It's
Yeah.
just same word, but meaning many different things. And
There's so much more that to look into when you're going to talk about God's will and how people approach that, how they use their own will, choose to use it. I mean, I wish I could have touched on everything, but I agree that, like I mentioned earlier, you're saying to say God's will is to say higher will. Turn it over to the higher will. You know, divine will, your soul's will. Your soul's in perfect harmony with the higher. If you can,
So you're still coming back to, it's your soul, so it's really
well,
still.
it's really you. It's you.
That's-
Your soul, you. I have to use those terms sometimes because we really are identified with our personalities right now, but really it is us.
and our
the soul.
Subconscious and getting into our conscious.
Yep.
I also like the expression to be a person of goodwill, because I think that includes an active component. It's not just a good person, goody-goody, it is a person of goodwill. There's a power
Yes.
in that.
Yes.
And it's directed the right way, and this is an opposite to a person of ill will, and
Yes.
whatever is negative.
And all of
And
us
that's the
can,
will you should
all of us can
develop.
cultivate goodwill,
Yeah, a
which is
person
will,
of goodwill.
has some action and some love tied with the will. And as the books, esoteric books say, you practice goodwill and it turns into will to good, which becomes even more powerful.
You said something earlier, I took some notes here, that it was actually a lack of will why people will sometimes get into an unhealthy relationship. And then you said
Yeah.
later about that our hearts need to get involved too. So it made me think about, well, sometimes that is why I'm thinking myself, why in the past I've gotten into relationships that turned out to be painful for me in retrospect. But because my heart got involved, then maybe in a way that wasn't healthy, maybe I was trying to caretake or because of my will, this person's going to have a good life or become healthy.
So you're saying that
But so I wanted to kind of.
a relationship where the heart gets involved, you're making decisions almost strictly from the heart, and maybe there's not enough will component. You know, the two have to, there's checks and balances, it goes both ways. If you're going to exercise your will, make sure you got the heart checking in on what you're doing. But likewise, if you're just going to lead with the heart, you better try to get some mind and will involved in that too.
And then thinking a little bit deeper is that, you know, I'm thinking of a couple of situations. In my heart, I knew that I was going to be learning a lot from this person, even though the relationship would wind up dissolving after.
It gets confusing. I'm sure you learned something. So, you know, who's this? It's kind of hard to, in retrospect.
Accepted a lot of love from those people.
It's hard. Your relationships can be tough. Sometimes they're karmic, and you're going to be in that relationship whether it was a good idea or not.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
All right, Ben first.
And when you have your will, or if you give your will up by God, there's usually like a contract kind of involved, like a social contract, like a Leviathan type of deal. So that's what, especially with religion, is like the negative or like original sin, or we have human nature is more negative and can't necessarily be trusted, so we need that contract. So
Okay.
the esoterics is that are is human nature more good necessarily? It's at different levels, so how do we?
So the question is, when we give up our will in a contract, like really governments encourage that.
Right.
To say, well, just you know, trust us and do what we want you to do, and it'll work out better than if you do what you want to do. Well, that's pretty nasty, I think. Actually, religions have been playing that game for a long time too. But there is a small scale of that I think is appropriate. If you go to a certain teacher and you say, I want to learn from you, a teacher might say, well, then there is discipline involved. And I'm not going to tell you what to do unless you say you want me to tell you what to do to learn this thing. So sometimes you do actually kind of very consciously put your will aside and take instruction. So there's a
Also,
balance.
You're growing as well. I guess growing in life too. I guess you have to give up your will in some aspects to gain, I guess, more will. Just like if you want to become a craftsman, you have to, give up some will to learn how to.
You might have to give up your will to drink beer to have will for something else. I mean, there's a trade-off there too. Always a higher level possible.
I'm sorry.
Okay, who else had a question?
It was just a statement that when I was looking up personality a couple of years ago, I tore the word up into its Latin roots, and personality means personare, where the wind blows through.
Hello?
Personare.
So person, sound, and person, sound blowing wind through as person. Expression of spirit through the human personality.
Spirit through the person is the personality, is what you're saying the definition was.
As I understand it, it comes from the Greek that it's the persona, the mask that they would wear during the dramas. And so the idea there, the mask, you got an opening for the eyes and the mouth. And so the spirit comes through that is the living thing comes through that mask. And so,
Yeah, persona, I've heard that too, the Greek word persona meaning mask, and that's one of the roots of personality. And that certainly makes sense too. We construct our appearance, our personality, and it can be like a mask.
There's the sound of the wind blowing through. The spirit blowing through the personality, through the mask.
An interesting aspect of that I didn't mention, gets pretty esoteric, is Lawrence, he says, behind all action is dynamis, this fundamental force that's part of primordial matter. And really, consciousness doesn't make things happen. It simply is a scope for dynamis to act. That's like the wind of action behind everything. And as we move along, we provide ever bigger scope of ability for dynamis to act, that just blind, always primordial energy that is not energy, it's the fundamental motion. He calls, matter, motion, consciousness, he calls motion the will aspect of the three. When you're setting things in motion, the will is involved. Yeah, the matter aspect is matter, consciousness, motion. Well,
Motion is the action.
motion is the will part of that.
Could you say a little bit about the sources that you're quoting in your handout? Like I didn't attend the prior talk. I might have missed some of the information on that.
Sure. The handout quotes from Henry Lawrence mainly. He's a Swedish philosopher that not all of his work is translated into English, but he's taken a great review of all of Western and Eastern philosophy and all of the theosophical teachings, Steiner and all of his other teachers, and he's put it in terms for a Westerner without Sanskrit terms. It would make, with very scientific, it's kind of like reading Leadbeater, if you've ever read Leadbeater. It's I find Leadbeater the easiest to read of the theosophical, and Lawrence praises him too. But that's been the treasure trove for me because it sums up what I found in all these other places and completely is, the references line up, it all lines up beautifully with Bailey, with Theosophy. And he analyzes both of those sources too. Roberto Saggioli, I quoted from his book, The Act of Will, in there, and that's got the techniques for kickstarting your attempts to improve will and how to develop it further. And then Lars Edelsko, I quoted from him, he is the person who translated Lawrence's work into English. He's a teacher in his own right and wrote a good introduction to the Lawrence material, his book called The Explanation.
Thank you. There you go.
Sure. That's one of Lawrence's books right there, The Knowledge of Reality.
It's a library book, but they're available at the bookstore if you want to order.
And The Philosopher's Stone's the only other one that's actually printed, but they're all online. You can print them all out from online.
When did he live?
He died a very old man in the 70s. So he'd been through, in this century, yes. Last century.
Yeah.
It's not this one anymore.
Maybe this is too broad of a question for you, but I have that book, The Knowledge of Reality, and I actually did a reading from it for my daughter's wedding this summer. It was But
I'd like to know what you found to read for a wedding.
Oh, I'll show you. It's beautiful. But he talks about envelopes.
Yes, bodies.
So, can you tell me what an envelope is in 60 words or less?
Everything except our fundamental monad, the point of consciousness and matter that is really us. Everything else is bodies. Everything else is envelopes. Physical envelope, body, emotional
Envelope.
and mental.
Okay, because he's numbered them also.
Yeah, that's because there's so many different terms for these things, it gets endlessly confusing. So only numbers can be not misinterpreted. He says the physical world 49.
Is it kind of in response to a chakra and the envelopes and chakras? Do those go together?
They do. Every envelope, each of the envelopes has chakras. Yeah, and they're like transformers that transform energy from the next higher world into this one. The physical chakras are transforming emotional energy into physical energy. And the emotional body has its chakras taking mental into emotional.
So the body itself is the envelopes.
Yes.
And areas of the body.
We have 5. We have physical, etheric, which is like the energy aspect of the physical, emotional, mental, which is the lower mental really. Higher mental is called the causal body, is the soul body. And we're trying to wake up in that body.
May I share something? I can't say this anywhere, but I feel more comfortable to share. The gentleman said about persona that the wind blows through.
Uh-huh.
And so when I was like about 14 years old, I visited church for the first time. And when I did that, this wind blows through my heart or like stomach area. And each time it does that, this light bulb comes on me, and I can see things suddenly. You know, some people had more meat, some people had more light. So when he said that, I was very surprised. I wind blowing through, and so that literally happened to me. And each time that happened, I had to look at my stomach because I was wondering if I had a hole in it. And then the dunamis day, you shared that this force, you know, the universal force coming through.
Dynamis, yeah.
So then eventually, when I was in Texas, I used to go to this church, and then I go to cell group meetings, and they were gathered to have a prayer meeting or the ladies meeting. And I was just invited, and I went there probably to eat something, I'm not sure, but when I walked through the door, outside the door, nothing happens. But when I walked through the door, as soon as I saw them, something came on me from the head to the, like this, and it was going through my stomach area, and I got messages that all their prayers were answered. And for some strange reason, all the ladies look at me at one time, and they have this angelic smiles. They feel so good, and so something told me that their prayers were answered. So I'm not saying I'm Jesus or anything like that, but when you know how Jesus was touched by the hem of his garment, and he said, "My power, my virtue went out." I had those experiences, like number of times, and that those stories that I hear, these words and stuff, that when I put it together, my experiences, it's just I can connect to those words, so I really appreciate it.
Well, there's so many things to say about those kind of experiences, but I don't necessarily relate to the will, except that it's not really a good idea to try to will to have those experiences.
Right, I never dream, but it just happens. That's why I said outside the door, I never thought of anything, but as soon as I walk in, it was there. And it's not repeatable in the same place or with the same people, just one time every so often in a different occasions. So you never know when you walk in somewhere, let's say you're in the bus and you say, bless everybody, you will that at the time. You don't know what's going on in that bus and you blessed everybody. I think we have that kind of power. The lady mentioned goodwill.
That's goodwill in action,
yeah,
sure.
Every moment.
Yeah, I do too.
What was Henry Lawrence's relationship to possibly the Theosophical Society in Sweden? Did he have any relationship or any connection to it?
He discourages all attempts to figure out who he is or what he did. He wants what he wrote to stand by itself. It's a pseudonym, Henry Lawrence. So that's not his real name.
Okay.
So we don't know.
So you don't know anything about his
We really
personal,
don't.
life situation?
He has one chapter that just barely got translated from Swedish on Lawrence, and he talks about the work that he does and how hard it was to get anybody to pay any attention to what he wrote, and the various battles he fought, because the kind of information he has is the kind that can wake people up And there are forces in the world very determined that people don't not wake up.
Yeah, no.
Because if the people woke up, they would lose their power. So
So we know nothing about his inspiration or whatever.
only what he said is not much.
Who his mother was.
Well,
I'd like to offer something just briefly, I wrote down here. The form of Buddhism that I've been practicing for almost 40 years is Nichiren, based on Nichiren, the Buddha who lived in Japan in the 14th century. And he wrote many, many treatises and letters to his disciples. And one of the most important ones that he wrote, that he said that this practice was the practice for observing one's mind. And one of the things that I've chatted about a lot over the years is that he said, one must become the master of one's mind and not allow one's mind to master them.
yeah, one must become the master of one's mind, observing the mind.
To develop that well.
That's basically saying, don't identify with the mind. It's not you.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on it,
Yeah,
in fact.
yes, the mind can be one of our vehicles for understanding.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's not our total reality.
No,
So it's been very, a lot of learning going on.
that's good stuff. Well, it's 5:30, and the talk goes till then, and everybody is free to go. And if you have more questions, I'll stick around.